Welcome everyone to Build 48 Part 2. The last of the components arrived, which are the Intel Core i9-10900K, and for the motherboard we decided on the Asus Maximus 12 Hero. I normally always install all of the fittings before I start on the tube bends, and that is because I like to plan out my tube bends and routes as I'm installing the fittings. Because the amount of fittings that you use doesn't necessarily come down to your skill at tube bending, it can come down to personal preference, and I find that most customers normally prefer more fittings to a certain extent. And for this build, it was quite important to have very short, clean tube runs because I wanted to match up to the distribution plates. With distribution plates, the loop is literally part of the structure of the case, and so I wanted the tubes right back against the components. I didn't want tubes running out in the middle of the build. And for this, more fittings are certainly needed. There is only so far you can go with bends to make them tight. I just wanted to briefly take you through how I cut and chamfer my tube. We already have this equipment for other reasons. You know, it is a lot of equipment to have just for tube. And so over the years, I just found it very useful for cutting and chamfering tube very quickly. All of this can be done with hand tools though. For the drill, I have an attachment which has an external chamfer attachment and also an internal one. But I use the internal one by hand because I'm not actually making a chamfer, I'm just cleaning up the inside of the tube. I always use O-ring grease before I install my tube, and I strongly suggest that you use a food grade O-ring grease if you're going to do this, something that is non-toxic, because some lubricants can damage the O-rings and also the tube, but more so the tube because most of the O-rings are nitrile, which are extremely tough, and particularly PETG, which is a softer tube, and it is actually known for softening over time. This was a problem with some PETG quite a while back, a few years ago, and it's very bad when it softens over time because it can reduce in diameter, eventually leading to leaks. This is one of the reasons I prefer not to use PETG. The other reason is that it doesn't have the same clarity, it's not as transparent, and also being softer, it heats more quickly before it bends, so you can bend PETG a bit more quickly, I would say almost twice as fast, but the bends deform more easily because the tube is softer. It doesn't hold its form as well, and you can't get as nice bends and offsets. And you can't get as tight a bend before it starts to deform. So I much prefer harder tubes. The tube I'm using here is Singularity Computers tube, and you can heat this very aggressively. It's very hard to get it to bubble, and you can get it very, very hot. And the hotter the tube is, the better really when you're bending it, because there's much less chance of it deforming and kinking. Any deforming and kinking, you know that the tube is just not hot enough. And if it's hot, it's just so much easier to work with. You'll notice that I'm not using paper towels anywhere except on top of the reservoir, and that is because I air pressure test all of my loops, so when you do that you can be very confident that you're not going to get any leaks. But something that often happens, it depends on the loop, is backflow. You're getting right to the end of filling your loop, everything's gone nice and smoothly, there's been no leaks, and then suddenly you switch off the pump and you get a huge amount of backflow and coolant goes everywhere. So this is something that can always potentially happen. You need to be very careful to avoid it. Sometimes if I can, I put my finger over the fill port when I switch off the pump, but it's best just to bunch up a paper towel and push it into the fill port. You'll notice that things are going differently when filling the second loop, and that is because I'm using the inlet on the pump top, whereas on the orange loop, I'm using the inlet on top of the reservoir. What this means is that there is more air recirculation because the coolant is flowing straight into the inlet, racing around the pump top and back out again. It's not flowing through the large volume of the reservoir, which means that the air doesn't have as much time to rise out, and you'll get a lot of micro bubbles. And people often contact me about this saying, I have something wrong with my pump, it's noisy, the coolant's not flowing properly, what's going on? Well, you just need to be a little bit more patient. The air will eventually come out. It just takes a bit longer. For this loop, it took about an extra 30 minutes.